I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting. That's Wiradjuri for me. My name is Amy. I'm from the Riverina Regional Library, and I would like to welcome you all. If you're going to be tweeting about this afternoon's sessions, please use the hashtag RA2020, and you can follow along on Twitter as well. This afternoon, we are first going to be hearing from Becky Spratford, who is, of course, an RA expert and trainer, particularly in horror, and I am really looking forward to hearing her presentation on Horror Readers Advisory. I don't like being frightened myself, so I need a lot of help in this area, although I do stretch myself and read and watch horror things as well. If you have any questions for Becky as we go along, please ask them via chat, and Ellen and I will pass those on to Becky as we go, and there will be time at the end for questions as well. If you are joining us, please make sure that you put your microphone on mute. I'll be doing that to mine in a second because the background noise can be really distracting both for Becky and for all of us who are listening along. And you can ask any questions, tech questions or anything via the chat. So welcome, Becky, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy. I'm so glad to be back. And I'm going to give a few introductory remarks myself because you guys don't know this, but everything you are getting today is absolutely world premiere, brand new. I am currently working on the 3rd edition of the Reader's Advisory Guide to Horror, and you are my first chance to take some of my research and ideas and get them out in the wild. So I really highly suggest that you, one, ask questions and ask them frequently. You know, I haven't given this exact presentation before to a live audience, but I do know that there's room for that. But also, I would love feedback. So you could see in the corner of every slide, there is my logo for RA for All. If you just type that into Google, it'll bring you to my blog. And I have a post today, actually, so it's actually yesterday for you guys. I'm actually still in Wednesday. So yesterday's date for you, the post has the information, but you can contact me at any time by clicking on that logo on my blog to get my contact information. And I am not just saying this to be kind. I actually want feedback. So please, throughout the presentation and afterward, things I could have told you, things we could have done better, authors you think I should have talked about. We're going to talk about how to help your scariest patrons today. And I'm glad that Amy admitted that she's not the biggest horror fan because that's the people I'm helping the most. We're going to get to seeing where we all are in a moment, but I do have this quote on the screen, and I think that this is the thing we're going to work with throughout the day. Almost everything I'm going to talk to you about today is going to be extremely focused on what horror is right now. And right now, by that I mean from 2010 to the present, the last decade. My previous book covered the time before. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about those authors and those issues. We're really going to focus on now, how we help horror patrons today. However, this quote is from 1988, and I can never find a better quote. This is a quote from Douglas Winter, and I'm not going to read it to you except parts of it because it's on your screen while I'm talking. But this is a quote that many horror authors today still go to and still look to for advice. And it's that last sentence we're going to spend the most time on, those last 4 words. Horror is an emotion. And I think that if you understand nothing else, you're going to understand that horror is about how it makes you feel, the emotions it stirs up in you. Just like romance, I'm going to make this correlation over and over again today, but it is because I need to drive it home. Horror is like romance, and then it is about how it makes you feel. It is a completely different feeling, of course, for romance versus horror, but it's the fact that it is, and I say this all the time to students and when I give talks, but we really have to think about the magic of this right now. We need to think about how, someone needs to mute their mics in the back, okay? Thank you. We really need to think about how authors take words that they have put together in a random order, and in those words have been strung together in sentences, and any author does this of fiction, and takes things that are absolutely fake and turns them into something real that makes you feel real emotions. And whether or not you like horror or whether or not you like romance, those are the two that really do it the most. But if you don't like horror, because that's what we're talking about today, we need to celebrate the fact that this happens, that fake things create real emotions. Which leads me to you who are here today. I'm not sure I'm going to really have a way for us to do a poll since no one's there in person, but I just want you to think about yourself and look at these questions. For you, what is horror? Is it a favorite genre? And go into the chat and say one of these answers. Is it just okay? Is it like Amy kind of said, which is almost exactly what number 3. I don't like reading it myself, but I kind of know how to help people who enjoy it. Or are you number 4? And please, if you are number 4, admit it. I am barely holding it together, simply participating in this presentation, and I may run away in fear at any moment. So put those in the chat, and if Amy or Ellen in a moment or two could let me know what the general tenor is, or if there's some good quotes we want to share. But the fact of the matter is, I want to say to you, we're talking about emotions here. I am not trying to convert you all to being fans of horror. In fact, that would be just completely against everything I teach, in everything I teach about Reader's Advisory. What I want you to do is to understand that you need to know how to help horror readers, and it doesn't matter if you are a fan yourself. As I hope Kathy showed you, there are plenty of resources that can help you. You don't need to be a fan, you just know how to help people. Do we have any consensus out there, Amy or Ellen?
We're mostly 3s and 4s.
And I'm going to tell you, let's go to the next slide, because the scary truth is, that is what we're dealing with in the library world. This is from a novelist, Library Journal, RUSA, the Reference and User Services Division of the American Library Association, study from a few years ago. And they asked, I think it was like 2,000 librarians, and if you click on that, the live slides, by the way, are on your wiki. And if you click on this screen, it'll take you to the entire presentation where this was part of. And in there is the data. But it was about 2,000 library workers in America, and they were asked what genres they fear most. And not surprisingly to me, horror came in 4th. And I would say if we do it now, I bet science fiction's gone down a little, but horror's still gone up. So great. You guys are 3s and 4s. That's awesome. That's what the most of the library world is. So we're right on par, and I'm going to be able to help you. Don't worry. So here's what we're going to do today, and there's a cover of the 2nd edition of my book. Do not go out and buy it. By this time next year, the 3rd edition will be coming out, but we'll talk about how you can learn a lot from it if you don't already own it. So I'm going to give you a new genre to be afraid of after today, because you're going to understand how to help horror readers. You're not going to like horror, but you're not going to be afraid of it. And that's literally my biggest goal. That is the goal all of you have for the next 80 minutes or so, is that it won't be your scariest genre anymore. I'm going to really spend a lot of time talking to you about what is the state of horror today, including current trends, including the top authors you need to know right now from a library perspective, and how to really understand why people like horror, since you don't really like it yourself. And I'm going to explain to you specifically how we're going to talk to fans. I might not explicitly say, here's a question I got, although that will come up, but we're going to talk about the ways in which we can talk to them and the language we're going to use, because you're going to know the things that they like based on what the general horror fan finds appealing. I'm really going to talk to you about must-know authors. They're in the screens here. You don't need to write them down. I went out of my way to not repeat authors, to give you as many as possible so that you leave with a nice, hearty stable of authors that you can confidently suggest to a wide range of public library patrons across the globe. Because I do have international and translation that aren't English speaking included. We're going to talk about resources, and we're going to really spend some time looking at them if we have time, although the links are there that you can look at them yourself. And throughout, I'm going to have plenty of tips and tricks. And again, questions at any time, especially at the ends of slides. So we're going to move on. And we're going to start with the definition. And thankfully, I have the textbook for libraries on horror, and this is the definition of horror. This was the definition in the last book, and I really don't anticipate changing it. We're going to address some of the issues with this definition and some of the common places where there are problems or I've had pushback from people on this definition. And we're going to explain how we can use that knowledge to help. But I am going to read it out loud because I think it's really important for me to put the emphasis. I like to say, and this is the truth, that this one sentence took me 2.5 weeks of writing time to do. My editor, Neil Wyatt, pushed me and made me hone it in and be specific. And I'm very proud she did that because I've been able to use it for 10 years since I first wrote it without very much change. Because horror is a story in which the author manipulates the reader's emotions. We've already discussed this. The whole point is to make you feel something from fake things, right? By introducing situations in which unexplainable phenomena and unearthly creatures threaten the protagonists and provoke terror in the reader. Let's break that down a little bit more. We're introducing situations which are not of our world. They are unexplainable by the common world we live in, and they're creatures that are not of this world. So we don't just have wolves, we have werewolves, right? We don't just have serial killers, we have zombies. This leaves place open for a speculative element. I was challenged very much to not use the word speculative in this definition. And I think it's important. I'm going to use it liberally here, but in terms of a definition, speculative is not specific enough. But know that everything that happens in horror cannot happen in the real world. Now, in the past, and I would say before I wrote the last book, it had to be a fantasy element. It had to come from quote-unquote magic. But honestly, I started to argue in the last book, and I had pushback from the editors on this, that science fiction explanations, that unexplainable phenomenon, scientific, could work. And we've seen that with the explosion of zombie virus novels. So it's definitely can come from anywhere that is not of this world. Any genre that posits something that cannot be. And then finally, we need to threaten the protagonist. So we're going to talk about sparkly vampires who fall in love with our protagonist. That is not horror. Some people might call it that, and we'll address that. Address that when we're talking about working with readers. But sparkly vampires are not horror. They're not threatening the protagonist. They're a love interest. They're a best friend. We're talking about books in which our unearthly creatures, our unexplained phenomenon, are causing the panic, the terror, the fear. And we're going to talk through different words that are used for different levels of horror, just like we talk about with romance. And then provoking terror in the reader. This is the thing all of you 3s and 4s need to understand. Readers who read horror want to feel unease, want to feel fear. I'm going to talk about this multiple times, but you don't have to want to. You just have to understand that they do. So that is the definition, and we're going to really even break it down more. So let's talk about this a little bit more. The bare minimum is that we have to create a sense of dread and unease in the reader. We are not always scared, and not every reader is scared to the same level. I see a lot of people say, well, that book wasn't horror because it didn't scare me. It doesn't have to scare. It has to create unease and dread. That's all it has to do. And we have to understand, again, just like romance. I once was in a romance genre study where 3 of us read the same exact book. We had a range to pick from. And 3 of us read the same book. It was Hate to Want You by Alicia Rai, R-A-I. One of us said that it was super racy. One of us said it was a little above average. That was me. Another one said, oh, that was tame. It was the same book. Those are 3 completely different versions of that book. So that's why I like to say, if you say it didn't scare me, so it didn't work as horror, scared, terrorized is not always the goal. It's this dread and unease. The element causing that dread and unease must be speculative. We already discussed this. I have it on the screen so we don't forget it. Again, I've also created these slides so that they serve as notes for you too. So you can go back and the main points are there. And again, that speculative thing that causes the fear must cause the fear. It can't be your best friend. Now, I really want to start and talk about what is not horror. First of all, I'm going to argue with you about what is not horror, and I'm going to give you examples of patrons arguing with me. That's why I'm here, to tell you the both sides of the story. But I'm going to tell you now, you never want to argue with a patron. I know you know this, but I've seen it happen. When someone says they really love horror and their favorite horror author is Charlaine Harris because they love Sookie Stackhouse. And you'd be like, that is not horror. That is paranormal romance. What are you, like, not understanding? It's fine. We need to understand that what is not horror and keep it in our back pocket, keep it in our reserve, so that when people start using terms that don't fit with what I'm saying, we don't use horror references and resources to help them, because we will not. So let's talk about some of these. I just mentioned paranormal, and I've used that as the example. Paranormal is when we sort of have sympathy for, and the heroes tend to be these creatures that are normally things that cause fear. But again, if somebody thinks that's horror, you go with it, but you use paranormal resources. I want to spend a lot of time talking about serial killers and psychological suspense, because those come together. So serial killers, I get a lot of pushback from people who like horror and like serial killers. And they're like, serial killers are terrifying. How can you tell me those aren't horror? And all I'm saying to you is, I'm not arguing that serial killer stories are not terrifying. No one is going to argue against that. They're even more terrifying, I think, because those are real people. Even if they're in fiction, they're human beings doing those things, right? They're not, and you guys are doing true crime today too. Same thing. True crime is terrifying because it actually happened. I'm saying that you don't use the same resources necessarily to help people, because there's a lot of people who read werewolf and zombie and vampire stories and folk horror and Lovecraftian horror who really love serial killer stories too. But I've seen just as many people who only like the intense fear and dread from real life situations, from actual humans, even if they're fictional fake humans. So we need to make sure that people are okay with a speculative element. And we're going to get to that when we talk about sort of doing the reader's advisory interview and conversation with a horror reader. Psychological suspense without speculative elements. And I say that because there's a lot of crossover these days with all the genres. And there are many authors who write intense speculative or intense psychological suspense with either the hint of or a little more than a hint of speculative elements. So let me give you two examples. So Sarah Pineborough is a British author, and Behind Her Eyes is a great example of an intense psychological suspense which has a very real speculative element that reveals itself at the end. Let's take another example of The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters. That is also an intense psychological suspense. It's historical fiction. It is set just after World War II in England. And it's the story, it's got that typical unreliable narrator. It's a family doctor who visits the home. And it's up to the reader to decide if he is stalking them or there is something supernatural out to get them. And then an author we're going to talk about a lot today is Paul Tremblay, and he is the king of this. He is the king of giving you a story and leaving it completely 50-50 if it was supernatural or if it was realistic, and he doesn't tell you. You have to decide. The most extreme version of this is his last novel, which was The Cabin at the End of the World, which universally won thriller and horror awards across the world because it does this so well. So we have to understand that. When I work with people who like Paul Tremblay, I have to understand. I say to them, well, what do you think happened at the end of Cabin at the End of the World or at the end of A Head Full of Ghosts? And how they answer that to me helps me lead them. Because if they answer, and I'm not giving away endings, literally he leaves it open. If they say, oh, it was all real and this happened, or it was all speculative and this was going to happen, supernatural, I'm going to take them in a different direction. Supernatural thrillers are the place where we really toe the line, and Traditional Monsters Revolt we're going to talk about in a moment, which is going to have another slide. But these are the two that are the most nebulous, and the line is less easy to draw. Supernatural thrillers would be something like the Joe Ledger stories by Jonathan Mayberry. Jonathan Mayberry, who is an excellent horror writer, but the Joe Ledger thrillers really draw that line where there are supernatural things happening, and sometimes they have science fiction, and yet they are all about the action hero, Joe Ledger and his team, the beating the bad guys. As we go through some of the appeals with horror, we will see how it differs from thriller. But some very basic ones are thrillers are all about the good guy coming through at the end and vanquishing the bad guy. And that doesn't always happen in horror. In fact, sometimes horror requires that the evil force is just beaten back and that it can come back later. Also, they're all about the action and the nonstop, relentless plot and that adrenaline pacing. And horror is not about that. We're going to talk about how horror is paced, and it is different. So that could be a problem. But for many horror fans who want a little bit faster paced read, supernatural thrillers are great. And I'm going to have a few examples that really toe that line very well in throughout this presentation, and I'll point them out as we go through. And then finally, this idea of traditional monsters revolting. Let's talk about that for a minute. Let's talk about the fact that zombies don't always equal a horror reader or don't always equal a horror book. I'm going to take an example, so real-life example of a patron. These are screenshots from Novelist, by the way, who liked The Walking Dead, right? Zombie story, we all know that, right? Let's look at the themes, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about themes and appeal today. There's a theme of zombie apocalypse, but there's also a theme of Band of Survivors. And any of you have ever helped anyone who either reads these graphic novels, the companion novels, or the TV show knows that some people do it for the zombies and some people do it for the idea of the survivors and how they're getting through. Well, this is a really great point. Just because somebody likes The Walking Dead, it has a huge pull on this Band of Survivors theme. And I would say for many people that I come across, one of the reasons this is the story that sort of transcended and became the zombie story of our world is precisely because this Band of Survivors theme is so important. So let's take a look at a few others that share this theme on Novelist. Here is Shipbreaker, a great YA adult crossover story. I'm pretty sure it got the Alex Award, but I'm not 100% positive, but it is a 7 to 12. Look at that. It has Band of Survivors, but it's also a climate change apocalypse. It is not a zombie apocalypse. It's still an apocalypse, but it's definitely not in the horror sphere. People might find dystopian fiction scary and chilling, and dystopian fiction is a great read-alike genre for horror fans. But that Band of Survivors is what's drawing people in. And let's go even a further step out. Let's take a book like Station 11, which has a pandemic apocalypse. Sorry if this is a little too on the nose, but it's a great example. And it's also about the Band of Survivors. And so this is what we need to understand, right? Just because someone likes something that's zombies, a specific title, doesn't mean they're only going to want to read horror. Think about yourself, right? You don't only read a certain type of book. And I bet a lot of you have had a relationship with one of these three titles that I picked in some way, whether you've read it yourself or you've helped somebody with it. I purposely picked extremely popular titles that you've had a touchstone with, so that you can understand how this works. I am not going to go out on a limb at all today and talk to you about super uber specific indie authors that you shouldn't know, that you need to know about to be in the know. We are only talking about titles that work with a very general and wide public library audience. Okay. Let's go back a little now and start talking about, instead of what isn't horror, I just wanted to kind of give time for that. And those are common things that come to me in arguments about my what I have to say. But let's talk about why people who like horror are lured to liking it. What makes them go over to the dark side? The best definition is from Stephen King's Danse Macabre. Again, it is from 1981, but it is still considered one of the best socio-political looks at horror. It's a nonfiction title, and just about every public library in the world has a copy. It's a look at horror and why people are drawn to it. And it's an excellent resource that you could look at. But I can take it even a step to make it even more realistic and more easy to understand. And that is a quote from me, in quotes. Horror readers are not monsters. They just like to read about them. I think you need to understand that. We're going to talk about how in really hard times people escape either with something worse or something better. And we need to understand that just because somebody likes horror, I mean, look at me, I'm not that scary. And you can't see me standing up, but I'm literally 5'3" with shoes on. I am not intimidating. Um, it's, we can't assign the feelings of the books to the people who read them. They just want to read about this for whatever reason. We don't judge, we don't care. And also, let's think about yourselves. Not underestimate how much human beings like being scared. Scared and fear is a primal instinct. It is something that's ingrained in us. It's one of the only things, and in fact, let's skip down to the last bullet point. Why does horror matter? It was a podcast I did last May with the people on that screen. And the one, Stephen Graham Jones, who's a professor, who we're going to talk about a bunch today, at the University of Colorado Boulder, who's an English professor, tenured professor, talks about this in his lectures and talked about it on this podcast. And please go listen when you have some time. It's about an hour of us with a live audience talking about why horror matters. And Stephen really talks about how fear is just this primal thing that we have to experience, that it's in our DNA. And when we deprive ourselves from it, it's denying who we are as animals at our core. But I like to go a little bit less esoteric and professorly and just think back to like the earliest stories people told, right? They were cautionary tales, things to keep us to follow the rules and to be afraid of the outside world, or to go back to your own lives. Telling horror stories by the campfire, right? That is an experience that pretty much every human has had. Sitting around in the dark and telling scary stories. Every town, every culture, and I think Stephen talks about this too, has horror stories at their core. They have stories about all the terrible monsters that go boo in the dark for a variety of reasons. And so we have to remember that this is a primal emotion and that we're hardwired to feel this. How are we doing, everybody? Are we good? Making sure there's no questions.
Nope, we're good.
Good, thanks. Okay, I also needed a drink of water. Okay, now we're going to talk about talking to horror readers a little bit. And that's going to be for a little bit here. So again, I've been saying this emotions thing, right? Well, great. You understand it's about emotions, but that brings a lot of complications, right? We're dealing with emotions. I already talked about this made-up stories sparking real feelings, but they're real feelings. When we help people in genres that are meant to appeal to their emotions, we need to understand that they're going to have an emotional response to the questions we ask, to the titles we suggest, and to the conversations we're going to have. I think being honest about this up front is important. You know, when I love helping romance readers, even though it's my least favorite genre to read, because I get them, right? Because it's an emotional reading experience. When I'm helping people, really, book club people are super easy to help. Because we could talk about, well, what are you looking for? Do you want to have something with complex characters, with life or death situations, with moral implications? It's a lot easier to find what they want because they're a lot more pragmatic about it. When we're helping mystery readers, think about how easy it is at times. We can ask things like historical or contemporary, right? We can say type of investigator, amateur, professional, and then type. Do we want it to be cozy? Do we want it to be gruesome? Do we want it to be somewhere in between? Do we want it to be procedural? There are questions that take emotions out of it, that are easy to check the boxes. But when we're talking about things like fear, dread, unease, terror, those are harder to do and to gauge and lead to more interesting conversations. So sometimes if you're a little bit less familiar working with readers, it's best to stick to some check boxes to mark off to help you get through what can be an emotional experience. So I'm going to provide those for you in the next couple slides. But I also really want to say it is okay, I'm telling you this as a horror fan, to acknowledge when you're helping the readers to say, it is not my favorite genre, but I know why people like it. And I'm going to ask you questions about what makes you scared. And, you know, you don't have to be honest if you don't want to. Just tell me if I'm pushing too far or whatever you want to share. Of course, we can use our techniques like share a book you've enjoyed recently, and we can look it up in places like Novelist and mark some boxes and do the things Kathy showed you today. We can do that. But again, I'm trying to take what is an extremely emotional situation and turn it into a series of check boxes. So the first thing, it's a great way to check how they're going to enter the genre, is sort of asking them ways in which it's best for them to communicate about these emotions. So I have a multifaceted approach here, and we're going to go over each of these areas in detail. And you'll get a sense of what those check boxes are for each area that we're talking about, and then you can sort of present them to people, not so formally like, here I am with my checklist, and I'm going to present to you what, you know, Becky told me to. You'll incorporate this into your regular work as you get more comfortable with it, and you'll figure out what works best for you, but I'm helping you walk through it. So we're going to talk about those traditional appeal factors, and that's really all I addressed in my last book, was the traditional appeal factors. We're going to add into that the idea of themes, which, as you saw with Kathy, are important, and I've worked with novelists on those at length. Then we talk about subgenre, and where subgenre and theme maybe overlap these days, and where subgenre works and doesn't work for horror readers. Again, for mystery readers, subgenre is great, right? The type of investigator, the time period. Like, there's really good subgenres we can go down to. With horror, we're going to talk about how maybe it doesn't always work for every reader. We're going to talk about media, because that is a way that people enter horror, is through things that aren't books. I'm going to talk to you about TV shows, movies, how to do that. We're going to talk about podcasts. It's going to be a lot of conversation about these things that are other ways we can have these conversations. And then finally, we're going to talk about the scare and the gore level, and I'm going to give you the top secret tricks and tips about how people talk about different levels of horror based on the words they use. All right, so let's get started. First, I do want to address what is the difference between appeal and theme. I know you talked about it, but I want to talk about it in terms of how I'm going to use it, just to make sure we're on the same page. Kathy and I did meet previously, so I don't think I'm outwardly repeating her. But if I am, I apologize, but it's always good to recap. Appeal describes the feel of the book, right? We know this. All those things, the pacing, the storyline, all those things I have listed. But appeal is extremely specific to the book itself. This book is fast-paced, character-centered, has a strong sense of place, has a small town frame. These are things. It's the book itself. It's individual titles. Each book has its own appeal. And to make matters worse, each person has their different version of each book, and the appeal of that book is different to them. I love to use the example of the Outlander when I teach basic reader's advisory. I use the example of the Outlander series because, the Outlander series, because I see different entry points for people. There are many people for whom it is a time travel book. There are for many people for who the first thing, if you make them only pick one thing, it's time travel. Make them pick one thing, it's romance. And others, it's historical fiction. And across the board. Now, of course, there are people who combine those, but I do force people in my talks to pick one. And I think it's extremely important to point that out because it's a specific book, has its own appeal, and it's different to different people. Okay, so it's a very personal thing. When we go on Novelist and look a book up, and I'm going to have some screenshots of some books with appeals, they give the full range of what the full appeal could be, but your version of that book might only use some of those. Now, themes take us out a step, right? So the appeal is about the book in your hand at the moment. The theme is the element that pops up in other books that they share. And we're going to give you tons of example themes and example books. So theme deals with the plot elements. It's about what happens in the book, not how the book is written and how the story feels. It's about what happens. So I'm going to give you I got from Novelist every theme they use for horror, and they're going to be on the screen here for you in one place with permission. But it is trapped with an exclamation point, which is a story element. So Cabin at the End of the World has trapped, for example. I'm going to have actual examples on the screen. But also, because what invokes fear for everybody is just as different too, we might have to consider both for our readers. And this is a big change in the way we look at all books, but really for horror, because themes tend to be more important than subgenre. And I say that because some of the things we used to call subgenre, like vampires, are really a theme, because they don't share much except that there are vampires. The books all appeal differently, and we will talk about this. So that is what we're going to talk about right now. We're going to spend time with appeal versus theme. So now I'm going to spend time with some stuff that I've been saying for many years, which still holds true in terms of appeal. So when we're talking about horror, the most important appeal factor in a horror book to a horror reader is tone and mood. Everything else I'm going to talk about can go in any order. Okay, I picked an order because I can't just talk about them in a jumbled order. I got to do an order. But tone and mood are always first. If a horror book does not set an uneasy atmosphere from the very first moment, it will not work. Many books, and think about books you've read, but many books start with a tense moment or something out of the ordinary that comes out of nowhere. And then maybe you go back, and that's not even a factor later. So Horns by Joe Hill is a great example. So we open that book, and Egg wakes up, and he's had a tough night of drinking, and he goes to the bathroom mirror, and he sees that he has horns growing out of his head. That's unease if I've ever heard of it, right? We're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about Victor Laval a lot, right? And so the Ballad of Black Tom opens with a very tense situation between a father and a son in poverty in 1920s Harlem. Now, the terror that comes later is completely supernatural and cosmic and way bigger, although I would argue not, than racism, that it's standing in for being as big as racism. But the things that are happening at the beginning, the very real concerns, a sick father, terrible situations, no money, living in Harlem in the 1920s, those are the things that set the unease from the start. And then, but it grows and grows and grows, and it's giving voice to our fears, and that's happening the whole time. Okay. Now, the characters I feel like for me are the second most important, but I also acknowledge that I am a character reader. You need to address with yourself what kind of reader you are, and the next thing will be the most important to you for horror. And talk to your patrons and have them say, when the reason we put appeal factors up is so you can say, what kind of mood do you look for in the book? Do you want it to be terrifying right away, or do you want it to just be an uneasy feeling that builds? Use these words to ask questions. That's what appeal factors are for. So when they've read a book, you pull it up and you see it on Novelist and you look at these categories, you can ask questions. Well, this book appears to be creepy and have, a really fast pace. Is that what you normally like in a horror story? Just use the words there and use what you know. So characters we care about matter in horror. Real characters we love and real characters we hate. The very best horror novels not only have a great monster that's a quote-unquote villain, but they also have an excellent human antagonist who is awful, who we're not upset when they get it at the end, or we hope they get it at the end. Sometimes they then become the servant to the evil thing, which is even worse. But we need to care about the characters. They need to be sympathetic. We need to identify with them. They need to be us. We need to care about that, because otherwise, why would we care that the monster is chasing them down and trying to kill them? There would be no fear. If we just wanted the characters to die and we had no sympathy with them, the book doesn't work. The pacing in horror is very steady. All books start at their own sort of base level. Some of them are more measured than others at their base level, and some of them are frantic from the start and only get worse. The base level is not really what matters. What matters is that all horror, the base level will matter to the reader. I shouldn't say it doesn't matter. It will matter to the reader where they start. If they start very slow or they start at a middle pace. But the point is that they steadily build. A horror book steadily builds, and by the time you hit the midpoint, it is moving quickly, briskly, no matter where it started. And by the time you get to the last third, it's really hard to put a horror book down. It's just rolling to that conclusion and everything's going. And even myself, who has read thousands of horror titles, I know when I hit sort of that last third, when I feel that chunk is, and I feel that pacing moving up, that chunk of pages left, I need to clear my schedule or just put it away till I have time. Because you're going to want to keep going. You're not going to want to get out of that mood and that tone. You're going to want to finish that story. When we talk about style and language in horror, it's important to note that it's an emotion that we feel with all 5 of our senses. It's extremely important in horror that adjectives are used very frankly, but they're colloquial. It's lyrical in the sense that there's lots of adjectives, but horror can't be too floating above the average reader and too metaphorical, or else you're not going to feel anything. That's not to say there aren't authors who write very metaphorically. There are. I'm going to talk about some of those authors. But they still keep the language frank. They still keep it honest and visceral, so you can feel things with all of your emotions. So you can feel and smell and taste and hear the fear. Also, a lot of horror, and I'm sure you know this, can be extremely quirky because that builds unease. Like, Dracula was written epistolatory, right? Found footage, there's lots of novels that do it. Last year, one of the top books of the year was The Twisted Ones by T. Kingsolver, and that used basically found, quote-unquote, footage. It was a found journal from a grandpa. But like Blair Witch is a perfect example of that in terms of media. But diaries, letters, found documents. I just reviewed in the current issue of Booklist a book called Eden by Tim Levin. I was hoping it came up before this talk because one of the best things about this, and I wrote about it in the review, and the review's also on my blog for free, that it's every chapter, it's eco horror, but every chapter is framed with these sort of they're fake documents that do the world building for us and create that unease and give us a sense of the world. And without those, we might not have the unease that we have. Flashbacks are extremely common in horror. Just about every horror book has some kind of flashback, if not a dual time frame, which is also very common. Why? Why do we have flashbacks? We have flashbacks because flashbacks do 2 things. They provide a break from the intensity when the horror gets really bad, but they also provide a chance for the characters to go back to a simpler time and explain to us where they've come from. Also, we'll talk about some of the storyline common issues. We're going to talk about themes in a little bit, but these are some of the common issues that we see across all themes. The speculative elements we've talked about. There's always a coming of age. Our characters have to battle themselves and grow up, and the demons that are after them too. And then a couple things here just about the darkness in people's lives, that horror is a safe place to explore the dark side of humanity. I like to say here in America, Law & Order SVU is still on the air, and I like to say that if you don't believe people like to look at the dark side, why is it still on the air? It's a really dark show. It's a place where readers can also face their own fears. As bad as things are now, it is not The Stand, right? And I think that that's really important. Or Wanderers that came out last year. Or Station 11. It also validates, provides escape from the horrors of real life, which, again, is well documented. People go one of 2 ways when their life is terrible, either to gentle reads or things that are easier to digest, or they go to things that are even worse. And Stephen King talks about that a lot in that Dance Macabre book. And it also validates a belief in the supernatural. Don't underestimate how much people love a ghost story because they know, a lot of stuff that happens in horror is about what happens to you after you die. And what is out there that we can't explain. And then I want to say this, the horror books can happen anywhere. They do not only have to be in a small, deserted town in the middle of nowhere. Horror can happen anywhere. You just have to have a frame and a setting that enhance that tone and mood. I like to give this example at all my Reader's Advisory talks about why tone and mood matter in relation to frame. So here are 2 examples of a beach house on an island. First, we have a beach house on an island. It's a bright sunny day and a young woman has just left a troubling relationship. She got in her car and she's driving to this beach rental, and she's going to have that writing retreat she's wanted to do for years, but she hadn't taken time for herself in this toxic relationship. And so she gets in and she opens the curtains and the sun is shining in, and she's on a deserted beach, and there's a knock at the door, and it's the extremely handsome caretaker. Go. And then you can take that same deserted house on that same deserted beach, but have her run away from her troubled relationship, crying and in the dark and in a rainstorm, and pull up and run in and lock the door behind her and have trouble catching her breath and not knowing what she's going to do next. And then there's a knock at the door. Those are two of the same frames, same settings, but with a different tone and mood. So that's how we can do anywhere and everywhere. Now let's talk about themes. That link will take you to all the themes, and I'm pretty sure you guys got that handout today in person, the flip chart, but that will link you to it. Here are the themes. I'm not going to go over all these themes, and I'm not going to give you examples for all of them, because you can go on Novelist and type these themes in and pull up example books. But let's just talk about, we can have themes of the main characters, that it's a band of survivors, that's childhood trauma, the final girl, which is that story where, the one girl is left and everyone else dies. Unreliable narrator, and some of these aren't just for horror, by the way. We saw that with Band of Survivors. That's one of the reasons I did that at the beginning. And then we have monsters, things I used to maybe call subgenres. Creature feature is great because it's like a bunch of creatures, or creatures that don't fit these categories, which is a huge trend in horror. Creepy clowns and bad seeds, evil animals. Oh, that's one of my favorites, by the way, because they're different than werewolves, vampires, and those things. They're evil and they're animals. Monster mayhem, which is different than creature feature, because creature feature is going to be more about, like, the creatures are at the center, and the monster mayhem is like the havoc they're wrecking is more. Real life monsters, which again are sometimes in, like, a book like Cabin at the End of the World has real life monsters and Trapped and other ones, because you could read it as real or supernatural, and I don't want to give it away. But I like to say about that book, it will break you, but you'll be glad you read it. And if you have children, it's tough, but I have children and I got through it and loved it. Vampire Menace, Werewolves Among Us, Witchcraft and the Occult, Zombie Apocalypse. And there's also then plot elements. I talked about this already. Trapped, Cursed, Possessed, Vengeance is mine. That's one of my favorites. I want to talk about Elks on a Rampage for Vengeance later. Yes, Elks. Setting, don't go in there. I like that one too. Small town horror, moving to a haunted house. Because it's always moving to a haunted house, right? You're not in one forever. And then I'm going to talk about Jack Jemick later. I'll point her out, but the grip of it is that whole story. And then style elements, body horror, which we are going to talk about later, found footage, Lovecraftian horror, which we're also going to talk about, and monster mashups. So you need to ask yourself as you're going through, are they looking for appeal or are they looking for theme? Again, I can't tell you how to employ these. Each reader, you'll employ them different. But as you know them and understand them and maybe look through these things and these words I've used in Novelist, you'll have a better sense of how to use them with readers. Which leads me to the whole talk about subgenres. Again, as I said this, subgenres in horror are not as clearly defined like in romance or mystery even. And I was someone who did subgenres as close as 5 years ago, and I realized I couldn't shoehorn the books that were coming out into traditional subgenres like I had in my last book. There's more to a demonic possession story sometimes than just that there's demonic possession. Sometimes there's other things we have to consider that make the story important. And I really am starting to lean toward the fact that I think themes do a better job of covering that. Here's the other thing, and here we're going to have some examples flash up on the screen. Authors do not write in only one subgenre across their works. There are mystery writers who literally change the name they write under when they write in a different subgenre, because subgenre is so important. In horror, they do not care. That is the biggest trend I've seen over the years, that authors don't stay in their lane, and readers don't care. Readers who like horror, who like a vampire story, one, don't like all vampire stories, and B, don't only like vampire stories. And even more confusing, they often can combine more than one of the subgenres and or themes in their same books. So I'm going to use Victor Laval as an example. And we're going to put these up on the screen. These are screenshots from Novelist. They're not in the order he wrote them on purpose. They're actually in backward order. So here's The Changeling. This is the book for which it's actually dark fantasy with horrific elements, with unease. And he won gobs of awards for this book. It is an opus of dark fantasy. And like I said, it's contemporary fantasy, it's horror. The theme is hidden among us, and it's one of those stories that's used in fantasy. Harry Potter has hidden among us, right? It's magic lying in plain sight, and that is the theme that is used there. And it is menacing, right? Okay. Then we're going to talk about The Ballad of Black Tom, which is a book that'll come up later again, too. And it is a retelling of an actual Lovecraftian story, The Battle at Red Hook, told from somebody that Lovecraft himself would have hated, a black man, which is awesome. And we're going to talk about that later, too. So here we have historical horror. We have Lovecraftian horror, which is a theme, not a genre, because it is about the way the story is told. So here we have him writing contemporary fantasy with horror elements. Then we have him writing Lovecraftian horror. And then we have one of my favorite books by Victor LaValle, which is The Devil in Silver, which is his oldest horror novel. He has other novels, but the oldest that's really just horror. And here we have a creature feature and witchcraft and the occult. And I can tell you, I've read all three of these books. This book, I don't know where to put Devil in Silver. And it's going to go in my book because I'm only including books from 2010 and after. And do I put it under a creature feature chapter or witchcraft and the occult? And also, it's also psychological suspense because this is one of those books that it is set in an insane asylum. It could all be in his head. Actual monster that is described to the reader because it is seen by our protagonist. But there's also a lot of occult stuff going on too. So he's not staying in his lane. Let's not expect our readers to. This is why I've given you a range of things to communicate with them about how they're best going to enter either a specific book or a range of books on a theme. Do not make yourself handcuffed, but also understand that there are things you can do. I'm not saying that, hey, don't even try anything because it could be anything. I'm saying that there are ways we can do this together, and you can help your patrons, but you have to be willing to sort of look at it holistically. Okay, so let's talk about media, because that's another entry point too. That's a little easier because a lot of people just want something really similar, and there's lots of easy ways to help those people. This is when we match people for, these things that I list here that they like that aren't necessarily books. Here's the good news. There are so many more resources to do this where people have done a range of options, and you're sort of off the hook. But I need to understand that the things that are popular are constantly changing and shifting. It's not Stranger Things right now. It's, if you click on this crowdsource the answers, it's Witcher, because that's really popular here right now. And tomorrow it's going to be something else. Those new obsessions pop up all the time. And locally you might have different obsessions. But you can crowdsource the answers, and if you click on this link, it'll take you to a Google page of read-alikes for people who like The Witcher, and it brings you to a whole bunch of different lists done by other libraries, done by Book Riot and other places, and they're really useful, and there's a lot of overlap. Novelist does this too, and they have the recommended if you like for media tie-ins. The internet will get to it faster than Novelist, though. For better or for worse. But then you can look the books up in a resource. But here's the thing. For you, the library worker who's a 3 or a 4, start with media. Don't dive right into appeal and themes. Those are a little more complicated and need a little more knowledge sometimes and a little more comfort. But media tie-ins, like what TV show are you loving? What movie? What's your favorite horror movie? Did you see The Quiet Place? Did you see Bird Box? Are you watching Lock and Key? And then if you don't even know what those things are, just start Googling them. Trust me, it works. And all they want is an answer from you. They don't need to know that you're a fan. They don't need to know if you've read it. They just want to know that somebody thinks it's a good match. So you say, well, I don't watch The Witcher, but here's this great list from such and such library or from Book Riot or from Reddit of people talking about it. Crowdsourcing is your friend. We're all Reader's Advisory. I'm going to have a lot of that actually coming up when we talk about things. Okay, we're going to talk about the scare level too before we start getting into authors and titles. We want to treat it as like a heat level for like romance. So here are the words we use, right? Let me just first say, like heat level with romance, each person sets their own comfort level, okay? So what is gory to somebody might, just like what is hot to somebody in romance might be fine to somebody else. But here's the thing. Those of us who review, and I am one of those major reviewers, both in Booklist and Library Journal, putting out a lot of the reviews you're going to see. They're there in Novelist for you to see. When you see those reviews, there are terms you need to go. I went through hundreds of reviews, both my own and others, to try to find some sort of standard language that we all use. So when people say something's atmospheric, creepy, or gothic, that's at the lower end of the gore and scare. So it's going to be creepy and unsettling, but not necessarily, all out scary. And it's not going to have a lot of gore. In the middle, it ratchets us up a little bit, right? We have dread, unease. We see things like frightening, menacing, bleak. Because bleak sounds bad, guys, but bleak isn't usually gory. So I want to make sure that's clear. It's a little more emotional. But when we get to the gruesome and the intense and the terror, and people use the word violent and gore, I'm very careful when I use the word violent or gore in a review. I want to make sure people understand that it's there. Here are some examples. Of the lower end, we have someone like Jennifer McMahon. That's a great example of the lower end, something like The Winter People. And these are all on Novelist. You can look them up. And you have access to the slides on the wiki, so you can go back. My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix is an excellent example of a book that's in the middle. There's not a lot of gore, but it is frightening. And it does have, it's not bleak though, but it is frightening. And then I'm going to pull no punches here. Little Heaven by Nick Cutter. I have read it. I have reviewed it. It is gory and it is gross and it is intense. And so and Nick Cutter in general does that. So that is your range, and those are some examples. But really think about look at those words in those reviews. They are more helpful than you think. I do want to talk about some possible limiters when we're working with people who are interested in trying horror, who may not be fans, because I think that's important to talk about too when we work with readers. Again, I know this seems obvious, but we need to remind people, especially those people who like psychological suspense and serial killers, who are thinking of moving into horror. We need to remind them that it has supernatural monsters and speculative elements, that the monsters are not all human-based, that there can be that graphic violence, that strong language, and sex are all possible. They're not necessarily common in every book, but they're possible. I cannot stress this enough, and I will bring it up again. No character is safe. If you read horror in the 80s and you're like, oh, that's the protagonist, they're going to make it through to the end. Nope. Not always the case. Main characters die. Main characters don't make it. And sometimes it's still with a third of the book to go. It's the truth. It's even sooner in some books. In Cabin at the End of the World, one of the main characters dies in the middle of the book. I got to be honest with that, because awful and uncomfortable things happen in horror, and that's why it's scary. If those awful and uncomfortable things didn't happen, it wouldn't be scary. So we can't delude ourselves. I'm talking about it like it's safe and easy for you to help people, but we want to make sure people know what they're getting into. And it's easy ways to talk about it, like, well, it's horror, so terrible things are going to happen. And people are like, oh, yeah, I know. Okay. Like, you don't have to make a big deal about it. This isn't about trigger warnings. It's about just letting people who maybe aren't familiar know what to expect and to help you. And then again, some people hate, and Paul Tremblay's the king of this. I just reviewed his brand new book that's coming out in July. I just turned it in this week, Survivor Song, which is a pandemic story. And it's his first book that has a completely resolved ending where you know what happens and you don't have to figure it out for yourself. And it actually resolves quite well, considering. But all his other books, it drives people crazy, and lots of people don't like this about horror, that the ending is fairly open. It's generally resolved, right? We know the bad guy went away for now, but there's still that chance that the terror will come back. And some people hate that. Okay, speaking of Paul Tremblay, we're going to talk now about authors for about the next, 10 minutes or so. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about all of them because they're going to be on the screen, and there are links for every single one of them to Goodreads, and every single author and book I'm talking about is available at Novelist. So you can take your time after this and go back and spend the time. Me book talking all these authors to you is a waste of your time and mine because you can do that on your own. Again, I provided the links. Okay, these are the authors that are carrying the mantle of horror right now. These are the three authors that I am saying are in control of horror, are writing exclusively in horror, and are leading it into its next steps. Victor Laval, the example I used previously, would have maybe been my fourth, or possibly a Grady Hendrix. But I'm going to tell you about Grady Hendrix. I think is a little too I love Grady Hendrix. He's actually a personal friend of mine. I'm not sure where he's going. He can be a little too silly sometimes, and he's also branching out. And the same with Victor Laval. He's really branching out to where all the speculative genres can take him. These three authors are fun. I've talked a lot about Paul Tremblay. I'm not going to talk more about him. He is the gold standard author right now. Carmen Maria Machado, Her Body and Other Parties, and her nonfiction memoir In the Dream House, which is a memoir told with a haunted house frame. It is one of the best books I've ever read, and it is terrifying, and it is real life terror, but she also talks about horror tropes quite a bit. Her Body and Other Parties, all of these books I have reviews I have written for, and you can look them up, and those links go to their Goodreads. No, they go to their websites, I believe, so you can see more about them, but you know where to go to find about them. Her Body and Other Parties, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more, about how she talks about weird fiction and body horror. And then Stephen Graham Jones, who I also mentioned before. Mongrels is his probably best known book, although his book that comes out here in America in May, called The Only Good Indians, and he is Native American, called The Only Good Indians, is one of the best books I've read in a long time. I joked with Paul Tremblay that, Paul, you've been my #1 horror book for the last 2 years. I think Stephen's going to beat you this year. He's like, I think Stephen's going to beat me this year. The Only Good Indians is amazing, and I'll have a link to it later. I have, at the end, I have the 5 books I think you should read right now. So these are the authors that I think for the next foreseeable future are steering the genre. I want to make it very clear that I take this very seriously, picking these authors. I've worked on it for a long time, because in my last book, I picked Joe Hill and Jonathan Mayberry, 2 authors you've heard of now, 2 authors who are New York Times best-selling authors, 2 authors who are ubiquitous, who have media properties. And I picked them when people barely knew them. I am not telling you this to pat myself on the back. I am telling you this because I know what I'm talking about. And these are authors you need to be aware of and keep your eye on. Okay. I also talked about the Old Guard in the last book. And in the Old Guard, I had authors like King, Kuntz, Rice, and Straub. I don't want you to consider those. I am literally going to mention them once in the new book, that, hey, these people used to be important. They're still writing books. Guess what? I don't need to help patrons find them, all right? I don't need to waste my time reading their books. They're going to go out. They're going to be bestsellers. They're going to circulate. It's fine. What I'm saying when I talk about the Old Guard are the authors right now, and I picked 2 men and 2 women, who the great majority of today's authors look to for advice, look to for guidance, and who are out there sharing their knowledge with the world. We're going to talk about Brian Keene again. We talk about his podcast that is just extremely influential and important. And he actually just wrote a book that's going to take the place of Dance Macabre. He has said it's going to. Stephen King has said it's going to. It's called The End of the Road. I have a copy, but it's only it hasn't come out in the mass market edition yet, so I don't want to talk about it till it's out. It's only in a special edition right now. But he is taking on that mantle. He has talked to Stephen King about it. They have worked together. He is leading that, along with his friend Christopher Golden. And Ararat is there. That's the Ben Walker series. That's the first book. It is that sort of edge of horror and supernatural thriller, but he writes lots of things. He also writes comic books, and he edits a lot of influential collections of other authors and promotes them and stands up for authors, especially women and people of color. Tananarive Due, who is one of my favorite authors and a wonderful human being. She has been writing horror for years. I picked The Good House because it's a great example of an accessible book. She teaches classes in black horror at UCLA. She is a partner in Shudder, the TV, the Blumhouse-owned horror movie streaming service. She works with Jordan Peele directly. She is really focused on African American horror, black horror as she calls it, and is doing the research, is teaching the filmmakers, is teaching the writers, and is extremely influential. And then Caitlin Kiernan, who is the grandmother of, and she's not even that old yet, she's like 61, the grandmother of Lovecraftian fiction. She is doing the work to keep it alive in its truest sense. She has donated her papers to the same place at Brown University where Lovecraft's papers are. She is carrying that mantle of that work. All of these authors are still writing. Um, Christopher Golden, when I told him he was going to be a member of the old guard, got upset. He's like, "Who you calling old Becky?" And I said, "It's not your age, it's your place in the genre." So these are the standard bearers, the people that the current authors are looking to. The new authors are looking to for advice and for help, and they're actively mentoring these people. Now, and you can look at some of these books while I'm talking. Something I did at the end of the year, and I did it, and I have, if you can click on that when you go to the slides, you can click on that link at the top that says the top 20 of the last decade. This is number 20 through 11. Something I did for the book and I put online was a list of what I think are the top 20 horror for libraries for the decade. The 20 titles that you need to know something about that came out in the last decade. So they came out between 2010 and 2019. I'm not going to argue about when the decade started. I'm setting it. That's what I'm saying. And I made sure to make a mix of type of books and reasons why they're important. And it is ranked, but I could argue here or there, except for maybe the top 3. And I'm just going to have you look at them. I'm going to point out a couple of them quickly. In the Valley of the Sun and the Rust Maidens are both first novels from the last couple years. First novels that are extremely influential. These are the 2 youngest authors I want you to keep your eye on. Andy Davidson had another book come out this year, early in the year, that is fantastic, called The Boatman's Daughter. And Gwendolyn Keist is up, I'm not kidding you, for like 3 Bram Stoker Awards for her nonfiction and her short stories. The Rust Maidens is a book everyone should read. We're going to talk about it a little bit. We talk about body horror. We've got a YA story there by Jonathan Mayberry, The Shining Girls, which is that book that really crosses that line with horror because it has a speculative element of time travel. So it's on that edge, but I really put it in there to show how that science is creeping in. I believe that Jonathan Janz's The Children of the Dark is one of my only small press, like smaller press. It's from a press called Sinister Grin. It's called Children of the Dark. It's an extremely influential story. I gave it a star review in Booklist where I knew nothing about this author. It's being shopped around by Josh Malerman's people to be a movie. There's a sequel coming. It's a book you need to be aware of. Amakatsu's The Hunger, historical horror. The Troop by Nick Cutter. We mentioned Nick Cutter before. It's gory. Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin. We'll talk about her, but it's great international horror. It's international, mostly non-English speaking. So I would kind of consider Australian not international, even though I'm in America, because it's English speaking. I have some Australian authors coming up. Hex, which is Danish. Bird Box, of course. But, it's not, I purposely kept it out of the top 10. I think it's extremely important, but it is not as important as these 10. The Passage by Justin Cronin, which starts our decade and goes through with a trilogy throughout the decade. Laird Barron, who's an author we'll talk about in a little bit, who writes historical folk, he writes crime. He had to be on this list. He's influenced everyone who's written. A Grady Hendrix book had to be there. My Best Friend's Exorcism, I think, is the nice starting point title for him. We mentioned Caitlin Kiernan, The Drowning Girl. Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones, I mentioned Ballad of Black Tom. And then I would say my top 5 are pretty set. It's The Ballad of Black Tom, which is that Lovecraftian by people of color. Nosferatu, which is Joe Hill calls his horror thesis. The Fisherman by John Langan, Her by Other Parties, and Head Full of Ghosts, which we talked about. On the screen here are more authors I want you to know. I would like to point out Karen Warren, who I love and know personally, who's Australian, and Lee Murray, who's New Zealand, and they also are fairly well known in America among horror fans. Karen Warren especially is starting to become more popular in America. I am not going to go through all these authors. I put them on the page for you to understand that you should go look them up and see why they are important. Ramsey Campbell's an older author who's on there. He was in my old guard last time. I think he's still important because he's writing weird fiction, Lovecraftian fiction. He's like the British Stephen King. Adam Cesare is a name I want you to know because this fall he's going to have a book that breaks him out. He's also a booktuber. I have 2 editors on here, although Eric Guignard also writes his own books and has won awards for them, but I think they're important to know. That I point out that Daniel Krauss writes for all ages. He writes horror for all ages. I think that's extremely important to understand. Let's see. Sylvia Moreno Garcia is a great example of not as scary horror that library patrons love. And Mary San Giovanni has an amazing podcast, which I don't think made my podcast list, but she does a podcast called Cosmic Shenanigans, where she's also a professor. She writes great cosmic thrillers, but she really breaks down what cosmic horror is, and you can go, oh, I do have a link to it later, actually. So she's important there. Oh, and I did not fix this. It's Zoji Stage. I'll add the J there. I fixed it on another slide. I'm sorry about that. Go back on your own time. I did not go over every author. They're all important. Go back and look them up and see what you can see about them on Novelist. Okay, and I'm going to try not to repeat those authors unless I really have to, and give you even more authors later. So, what are horror resources? I'm not going to go through this. I'm going to let you go explore. But I have reviews in Library Journal and Booklist, and you don't even have to have access. They're on my blog, they're on my horror blog, and they're also on Novelist. Please look at the Novelist Library Reads Crash Course in Horror. It was just done last spring. There's a link there right there. I run an international reading program called Summer Scares. This year I'm doing it with the Horror Writers Association Library Journal, School Library Journal, and Book Riot. We do it together, read about it. We have some books picked. This year, Stephen Graham Jones is our celebrity spokesperson, and we picked him because Mongrels was one of the books last year. We actually had Mongrels, a book by Tana Rivadu and Brian Keene last year. And we actually changed it this year, and the books have to be 2 to 5 years old. And the year before, it was Grady Hendrix as our inaugural spokesperson. Horror for Libraries is the hashtag I use on Twitter when I talk about horror, and I've gotten a few other libraries to start using it. When you talk about horror in social media for libraries, try to use this hashtag. I only use it on Twitter. Feel free to use other places. It's a great way for library workers around the world to gather information that's specific to libraries. There's a lot of horror social media people, and this is specifically to libraries. And then my RA for All. You should go explore on your own, my RA for All horror. Go there. Here are some things I do. I have my favorite resources. I list all the awards. You can go look through them. I have little explanations on why I love them. I have my list of trusted independent publishers. I ask authors every year for the month of October to share why they love horror. You can use that tag and read them. And I have original lists and content that you can see. Go take your time. I'm not going to take my time to show them to you today. That just seems silly, right? I want you to do them and to use them as you can. But I'm not going to spend all my time talking about them. You can do that. Here are the podcasts that I wrote about last year in Library Journal and why I think they're the most important podcasts. And I broke them up into fiction podcasts and nonfiction podcasts. The fiction podcasts all have a different slant. So like Monsters Out of the Closet is LGBTQ horror and Nightlight is black horror. Pseudopod is the big one that everybody knows. So you can take a look at these. And then I have nonfiction and informational podcasts. And these are where they either talk about books or they talk about the genre. And you can spend your time looking at those and listening to those. Brian Keene is the one I would say, the Horror Show Brian Keene. If you want to know what's happening in horror right now, that's the one you listen to. He goes over the top news stories every week, and then he always interviews an author or a creator. Here are some trends I'm going to go over in a couple slides very quickly before we get to the end and have time for questions. And again, I have tons of links for you to explore these trends on your own. So short scares is a huge trend. I think short scares are so popular. And what I mean by short scares are novellas, anthologies, and poetry. And why are they so popular? People are getting used to horror in smaller doses, whether it's TV shows or movies or podcasts. And what's happening is they are want to get it in smaller doses. And one of the other reasons that short horror works really well is it's all about being scared, right? And if you can read it in one sitting, or in only 2 if it's a novella, the fear is more present and stays with you. When you can put it away and like the podcast said, books in the freezer, and put it in the freezer and let it mellow for you, it's not as intense. So for novellas, Tor.com is leading the way. I used The Ballad of Black Tom as a great example. I made sure there was a novella in my top 20 of the decade because novellas took over in this decade. I did a list in Library Journal last year of the best horror novellas of the last couple of years. I want to make sure we understand the difference between anthologies versus collections. Just real quick, an anthology is by multiple people and a collection is by one person. Just make sure you know that. There are some people that only want to read stories by one author. And I just heard this the other day. Usually collections don't work for me because it's only one author. But I love anthologies because I get a different view of the horror from every person. And then don't underestimate horror poetry. It is really, poetry itself is a growing market, and horror poetry is among the very best. And the best publisher for that is Raw Dog Screaming Press. They also publish Lee Murray in some of her novels, so you might be familiar with her, with them, but you should take a look at them. And then there are awards in each of these formats, thankfully, to help you find the current and the backlist titles. So you can look up novellas, you can look up anthologies, you can look up collections in poetry, and see who's nominated right now and see who's won in the past. The Bram Stoker Awards database link is there, and you can get to that from that link and look at all of these things. Here's some authors we've already talked about. I mentioned the Twisted ones also. Another trend is folk horror. So for our purposes, I'm defining folk horror as horror that's based on folklore and on rituals over generations. I am not saying it has to be set in the past. It also is not searchable on Novelist. When it's not searchable on Novelist, I am going to point it out because that makes it harder for you. But I am also going to point out every time that there is people who tag something with this term on Goodreads. Because when you ask the fans what is folk horror, guess what? That's what matters more than what I tell you. So when you click on that link, you'll see, and it'll run itself every time. So I won't have to repeat myself on these other slides. With what is folk horror, it'll run itself every time, and you can see the top books tagged folk horror. And here are some examples on the bottom of the screen, and those are covers of titles. Some of them I've talked about, some of them I haven't. But again, you can go back and look these all up on your own time. They're here for examples. By the way, I realize this is a lot of information I'm giving you in a short amount of time, which is why I made sure there's plenty of time and things for you to go back. Okay, body horror is another huge thing right now. It really focuses on the graphic and psychologically disturbing mutilations of the human body. There is a great article called On Body Horror and the Female Body from Publishers Weekly by an author, and I purposely didn't put her book on here because you'll get it when you link there. And I've also talked about this before in other places about women, and as you see, almost all of these are women except the John dies at the end in the middle. And I've read all of these books, and they all do body horror in a different way, which I find very interesting also. But when we talk about women and the violence that is done to our bodies and how we feel about our bodies and the victims we become, especially with the Me Too movement, body horror is being taken over by women, and they're running with it. I've also seen some articles talk about how body horror is so popular because zombies were so popular, and zombification is a form of body horror. I'm not sure if I'm sold on this yet, but I'm putting it out there because it is being discussed. And so there's a lot of arguments that body horror is what we have after zombies have gotten sort of boring. And again, the fans speak on Goodreads. You can see what fans are tagging body horror. Historical horror has been popular for a long time, and I want to remind you that historical means that it's set in the past before the author's lifetime or experience. I like to use the example for, it's the same as historical fiction, right? But I like to use the example of Pride and Prejudice for historical fiction. Pride and Prejudice is not historical fiction. Pride and Prejudice is chick lit / romance written during its time that we read now with a historical lens. But it was written as a satire and a commentary on its own time. All of these books look back to the past from now. So Dacre Stoker and J.D. Barker wrote the official prequel to Dracula based on notes from Dracula, but it has a sensibility from now looking back. Weird westerns like Unbury Carol or steampunk, like Bone Shaker, I also include in historical horror because they're doing alternative history, right? So it's alternative history, which is like historical fiction with speculative elements. So that's where these fit in. Okay, Paperbacks from Hell. Grady Hendrix wrote a book with Will Erickson, and I can link to his blog with all the work about Paperbacks from Hell. What are Paperbacks from Hell? They're basically the books that came out in the 70s and the 80s with those great covers, and they're there, and they're coming back now. They're being brought back. Valancourt took over the Paperbacks from Hell name from Grady and Will, and working with them to bring back these books. What I love about what Grady and Will are doing is they're not just putting out the bad books. They're finding the very best titles that have been lost into obscurity. And as Grady likes to say, a lot of them are by women. Women wrote a lot of these books back in the day. And they're acknowledging when the books are racist and sexist, but they're trying to find the ones that are not. And again, Paperbacks from Hell is a term you can search on Goodreads, and it doesn't just bring up these books here that are from the Paperbacks from Hell line. One of my favorite trends to talk about is the reclaiming of Lovecraft. I cannot get enough of this one. Look, H.P. Lovecraft was not a good person. He was, even during his time, people didn't like him. He was racist. He was sexist. He was misogynistic. He was homophobic. And he hated people in general. But he wrote some of the most influential stories that are still resonating in horror. And he brought this whole idea, we're going to talk about cosmic horror next, this idea, though, of these sort of aliens coming down and causing the horror, and these things like terms like Cthulhu that you can say and people know. You see tentacles on a book, and you know that you're talking about Lovecraft. But what I love about this reclaiming of Lovecraft is these authors, and every single one of them, we have a person of color dealing with racism. This is a person who has a lot of problems with the community, but also an affection for it, and an LGBTQ person. Caitlin Kiernan writing about these stories. It's this reclaiming, and women especially are doing it. It's this reclaiming by Lovecraft and embracing what made him great. And as I like to say, giving him the middle finger and showing him how they can do it too. And I really think that there's so much great about this. Lovecraft Country will be an HBO TV show, so pay attention to that. It's one of my favorites. I have a book talk of Lovecraftian horror. It includes a book talk of I Am Providence and Lovecraft Country in it, and it's a video. It's audio mostly just, so you can listen to that on your own time. And again, the fans speak on Goodreads. Find out what the fans like. Again, I can tell you everything till I'm blue in the face, but really what matters is what our readers think. And we're finishing up here soon, so I hope you have some questions. Weird fiction. It is related to Lovecraftian, but it is its own thing too, because the stories I have here don't explicitly invoke Lovecraft, but they are weird. This has the longest definition because I wrote a definition of this for the Adult Reading Roundtable's 5th edition of the popular authors list that's going to be on Novelist, but is not there yet. So I wanted to make sure you had the whole definition. And what is interesting is that weird fiction blends the tropes from both horror, science fiction, and fantasy, maybe all three, a combination of the two. But the point of weird fiction isn't just to make you scared. It's actually actively trying to disorient you and the protagonist. So often we end these books being completely confused. But and feeling dread about that. But there's also a lot of wonder and enlightenment that come from these stories. I think if you want to try one, I would try Fever Dream, although I do love Her Body and Other Parties. It's stories, and not everyone loves that. Fever Dream is a novella. I think it's technically not because it's over 40,000 words, and if you talk about a novella, it's technically, according to Ellen Datlow, she gets mad if you don't say this, 17,000 to 39,999 words. I believe Fever Dream is more than that. I believe it's just over 40,000, but it's short and you can read it in a sitting or two. She's Argentinian, and it's translated, great translation. It's the perfect example of what I mean by weird fiction, and it runs that gamut from confusion to enlightenment and wonder. And it's not super scary. I mean, it's still scary. Here are some authors I want to talk about that are international authors. They're all mostly in translation. Like Nunzo Ono, who's one of the leading Nigerian horror authors. She's also like Nigerian British, so she writes in English. Eric Guignard, who I mentioned before, did this great compilation of A World of Horror. Karen Warren is in this collection. It's an anthology of dark fiction writers, speculative writers from all over the world, either originally in English or in translation. And just the table of contents alone, if you actually, these are not clickable, but this one is. If you click on this, it'll take you to Goodreads, and it'll give you the full table of contents, and look up some of those authors. But here are some books I would suggest you start with right away. Also, She Said Destroy by Nadia Bulkin is on our Summer Scares this year. Oh, and In the Valley of the Sun, which I mentioned in my top 20 of the decade, is also on our list this year for Summer Scares. But Nadia Bulkin is American, but she's an Indonesian and grew up part of the way there. And these are stories, deal a lot with Indonesian horror tropes. So it's really great. This is, I believe, Mexican horror. I might be misspeaking. It is from that part of the world. Let the Right One In, you've probably heard of. Not on my top 20 of the decade because it came out before. Mouthful of Birds, I mentioned Samantha Schweblin before. And one of my favorites is Frankenstein in Baghdad. It's a Gollum Frankenstein story told in Baghdad. It's beautiful. I really love it. Okay, so we're just about done, so there's going to be time for questions. I just want to remind you of this slide that I have, that these are 5 titles that I say you should start with right now in 2020. Here, this is what I'm going to say. A lot of you are probably feeling like, oh my gosh, I missed so many authors. I haven't heard of a lot of these people that Becky's talked about. And my goodness, that slide with the 2 columns, I have to learn all those authors. No, I missed all these books. What am I going to do now? My advice to you is to not worry about that right now. In some free time, look up some of those authors. Read some of the reviews. Again, they're all in Novelist. It's a one-stop shop, right? You look up the author, you look at a title or two that I've mentioned, and you look at the reviews. You get a sense of how they write. Why not start from scratch? See, I fixed Zoe's stage here. I believe it's pronounced Stage. She's American, but she's Israeli. So, and I've met her, and I never asked her how to pronounce her name. I should have. But I did meet her, like, going in and out of a bathroom, so that probably wouldn't have been appropriate. So these are books that are coming out this year. I believe none of them are out yet. Wonderland is coming out April. But these are books that are for 2020 that are going to be, and I've read every single one of these. And I believe if you haven't seen it yet, you will see a star review of every single one of these in either Booklist or Library Journal. So I'm not kidding around when I'm telling you these are the books you need to read. These are going to be on the year-end best lists. Mostly I can say that with confidence because I make the Library Journal best list along with the 2 editors. So I'm really confident that these books will be there. These are stories that you can start with, and they represent a huge range of the type of scares you can expect. Interestingly, I went on this list that you can see at Lit Reactor, done of the 15 books that the 20 books to look out for in 2020, and I was going to link that somewhere here anyway, and I realized that the 5 books I had picked happened to also be on that list. So interestingly, that worked out great. And you can find 15 more. There's books by people I've already mentioned, like Mary San Giovanni, Max Brooks, authors that have been on the screen, and some that you haven't heard of. So you can take a look at those. And now I'm on my last slide, so I'm going to put up a slide with contact information at the end. But if you have questions, now's the time to type them. I want to remind you that even if you're still feeling scared, horror is everywhere, okay? It's creeping into all the genres. Elements of it pop up everywhere, but it's in our media, it's in our news, and it's in our politics. So we can't run away from it anymore. But it's also an escape, as I've talked about. And let's talk about this. The increase in gentle reads. I just saw the Library Journal study of Material Survey of American Libraries. Cozy mystery rose the most of any mystery genre across the board. And romance is seeing a renewed popularity because all of those are on the other side, right? You know a romance is going to end happily. You know a cozy isn't going to have a lot of blood. You know a gentle read isn't going to do a lot of things that are going to make you upset. There's a reason that there's rising in both of those. And horror is more popular than it's ever been. I mean, Library Journal, it didn't have to do much convincing. They gave me a column 4 times a year that they're paying me to write to get more horror reviews in there. I've talked about this, that no one is safe. I just think it's important to reiterate it. There is, though, still a reluctance to use the H word, horror, in publishing. Every year I write a horror preview for Library Journal that comes out in the July issue, and I mostly do it off of using Edelweiss and seeing what is being promoted as horror that's going to be coming out. And I have to make decisions on which books to highlight and look at some trends and see what to tell people the forecast is. And I have a lot of trouble because they don't use the BISEC code for horror. They don't use the term horror. They use every word but horror. It is so frustrating. So it's hard. But on the other hand, if it's literary horror, they put that in there. Please don't do that. If you use the term literary horror, my editor at Booklist is always like, I know I'm not supposed to use this term, but, and I'm like, but don't use it. Because when you say something is literary horror, when you call Stephen Graham Jones's book or Paul Tremblay's book literary horror, or Carmen Maria Machado, who that book was nominated for the National Book Award here in America, when you call it literary horror, you're demeaning every other horror book as not worthy. So please don't do that. And then finally, let's keep an eye on the fact that there's going to be a huge game changer in 2021. Macmillan Tor is going to have an entire line called Nightfire that is going to be unabashedly horror. And they are not going to be afraid to use the H word. And their first books come out in 2021. So as I end, I want to remind you that we need horror. People need it because it helps us make sense of a cruelly senseless world. And this is one of my favorite quotes because I think it's important. Nobody will say they love horror. Well, us weirdos will. But horror really helps us make sense of the world. And I think we can all see that right now also. And that is the end. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Becky. That was really, really helpful. I never realized that supernatural had to be an element in it. I thought realistic things that were realistic and horrific could be horror. So that just even the definition was really helpful for me.
Right. You know, it can be for you. It can be for you, and that's okay. But if we're talking about things that are horror, we want to try to keep with supernatural. Right.
Yeah, well, and that's really helpful to understand.
Good.
There's so much information in there, and I'm so glad
Yes.
that your slides are available for everybody. But if you wanted to stop sharing your screen, you would be able to see the
Yes.
chat.
Oh, great. And let me see if I know how to do that, though. Let me see.
Maybe
Is it
up the
sharing
top,
screen?
stop sharing.
I'm trying. Hold on. I'm going to try.
Well,
Let me
everybody, if
escape.
you want to put
Yeah.
your
Oh, I
questions in
got
the
it now.
chat.
I got it. I got it. Yep. Okay. Ooh, there's a lot of chat. All right. Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to start at the bottom. Sorry. There are lots of ways to do the RA interview with patrons. Yes, that's what I think you really need to learn, that there's lots of ways to do it. And I'm trying to look. Oh, so other subject headings other than Band of Survivors. I think that was earlier in the talk. So, but I did give you lots of other headings to use, and all of those are from Novelist, and you can use them. And people thought that I don't have a dog. I have children, but not a dog. And I'm sorry, Rachel, that yes, the heroes and heroines die. So let's see. If you don't want everyone to die, talk to me, and I'll tell you what book not to read. But I will not give it away. But my contact info is on my blog, and you can reach out to me. But you just click on the logo. But I can tell you some of the books in that top 20 that you don't want to read if, like, the main character dies. So we can talk about that. I don't want to give it away for other people. Yeah, and that's good. Yeah, I think you guys, I think there's a lot of information. What I would really like to say to everyone is take some time after this. Let this sit. I know this as somebody who does these trainings. I love hearing all the information. I get super excited. But the worst thing you can do is to go and start looking it all up now. Really. I'm going to tell you that as a trainer and as a librarian. Take some time and let it sit, and like in a week or two, pull the slides back up. They are not going anywhere. Pull the slides back up, and then take a look at some of the authors. Maybe try to read one of the books that I mentioned, and look it up on Novelist, and spend some time. And if you're if you're number 4, you know, you're super scared, do it in bits. Give yourself little bits and pieces.
Excellent. Well, if there are no more questions, we're all going to have a little chat amongst ourselves in a minute, Becky, about what our takeaways are. So before we do that, we'd just like to say thank you so much. That's been really, really helpful, and we're going to be going back to those slides over and over in order to help our patrons.
Great, and that's the goal. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day. I am going to get ready for bed, though, here.
Sleep well. Thanks so much, Becky.
Good night, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye. So everybody, what we're going to do now for the next 10 minutes until 2:40 is to get on the chat and to talk about what we're going to take away, what we're going to do from what we've learned from Becky. So I'd like you all to write something for yourself, what you're going to do, but also to comment on what other people are going to do as well. This next 15 minutes is also the time that you have to make yourself a cup of coffee, take a bathroom break, whatever you need to do, because at 2:45 you'll need to go to the next link from the wiki in order to get to our next session. So just to repeat, for the next sort of 10 minutes, we can be on the chat in this session, and then we'll move to the next one and get the link for that on the wiki.
So you actually, it's contrary, really, that's online. Yeah.
Yeah, I used to.
We don't have a coordinator. Seating, but this is a desk waiting. All right. The other desk. Yeah. Cool.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, I'm loving this. Yeah, this is your first time.
Okay, everyone, don't forget that those slides are available now on the wiki if you want to go back and look at those and follow all the links. But for now, we're going to go to the next link and we're going to hear all about true crime. So see you over in the next session.